following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of The Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. This is a special legislative preview edition, and we have all guests from public broadcasting, so you know it's going to be a great conversation. With me in studio is Christopher Conover of AZPM, and joining us from Phoenix are Camryn Sanchez of KJZZ and Wayne Schutsky of KJZZ. Thank you all for joining us on this special edition. Wayne, I'm going to start with you. We know there were disappointments for the Democratic Party in many ways as far as November's election goes, but there was a lot of expectation. I don't know if this was just pundit expectation. The Democrats would at least tie in the Senate, maybe gain a seat somewhere, Senate or House. As it turns out, Republicans have expanded their advantage, expanded their majorities. What sort of impact could that potentially have? It's not as though even when there was a one-vote split, these parties were talking all that much, but how do you see this? Do you see Republicans extending their power, trying to do even more than they have before?
I think what it does is it consolidates their power. With the one vote majority in both chambers, it gave kind of any individual member the opportunity to, kind of freelance or maybe get something that they wanted in return for going along with what leadership wanted. It also gave room for a few compromise votes, like we saw with the territorial era abortion repeal, where we saw a couple Republicans cross over lines. It's going to make that kind of stuff just that much more difficult because Democrats will need to woo even more Republicans over to their side to push their priorities across the line.
Camryn, on that question, please give us an answer. But also, is there someone that might stand out to either of you who maybe didn't have, obviously Steve Montenegro is new Speaker of the House, but anyone who was already actively in the legislature before who may try to flex his or her muscles a little bit more during the upcoming session?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that. And I think we've got some newcomers who are all waiting to see what they're really going to be like. But there's some shifts in power dynamics. I think within the Republican Party, it's pretty well established that there's these smaller groups. One of them is the Freedom Caucus, of course, the most famous. It's sort of the MAGA far right wing of the party, and in the House they sort of lost some of their old members, but in the Senate they gained, and some of the new people might want to join on to that, and we don't know yet, but I think their influence has shifted. And I think in the Senate I'm still watching Jake Hoffman. I think that this sweeping victory is only emboldening that part of the party, and he has a lot of influence, and I think that Senate President Warren Peterson has ensured that at least in the Senate, the Freedom Caucus is just as strong.
Chris, before I go to you, Wayne, let me ask you about Steve Montenegro in particular, because people know him as a lawmaker from a number of years ago and then had a failed congressional run. He is, to my eye, he's a conservative. He worked for former Congressman Trent Franks for years, and yet he is not part of the Freedom Caucus. How do you think his role in being chosen as the speaker might affect things going forward?
At this point in time, I think he's going to be much of a continuation of what we saw under current Speaker Ben Toma. As you mentioned, he's very much a conservative. I don't want to try and paint him like he's a more moderate choice necessarily on policy, but he's not a member of the Freedom Caucus. He actually defeated a member of the Freedom Caucus, Joseph Chaplik, who was also seeking the speakership. So I think what the membership of the Republicans in the House did is they chose the candidate who, like I said, is going to be a continuation. So pushing those conservative policies, but maybe keeping some of those impulses towards bombast and headlines and kind of that kind of stuff maybe at bay a little bit more than you would have had if a Freedom Caucus member had taken over the chamber.
And what will be interesting with Montenegro is exactly as Wayne said, how does he keep some of those bombastic voices, those Freedom Caucus voices, a little bit in line so that he can keep the others in line also for the votes? Because even though Republicans picked up seats, they didn't pick up that many seats. But also it will be interesting to see how Montenegro's history over the next 2 years plays in, because as you said, he ran for Congress. He came in third in his primary, but there was a real push within the Republican Party for him to drop out of that primary in 2018 because he'd become embroiled in a controversy with inappropriate texts back and forth to a Senate staff member when he was a senator. And a lot of people said, oh, that's it. He's finished politically after he came in third in that primary. and all of the controversy around that. So that's still looming in the background. So it'll be interesting to see how he manages all of that.
Camryn, let's go back to what you said about Jake Hoffman. Obviously, he has a considerable amount of power, but I wonder with Peterson and Hoffman, how do you anticipate that side getting along with the House leadership, including Montenegro?
I agree that it's going to be somewhat similar to last year, because even though the Republicans have strengthened their numbers, and even though Trump is now at the top, getting to dictate his agenda, they still have to deal with Hobbs at least for a little while longer. And so when it comes to the budget, for example, I think they're going to still be making deals, although I think that there's even less of an incentive than there has been, and there's never been too much of an incentive to include legislative Democrats. And I think that, Peterson and Montenegro, to the degree that they even can control their members, sometimes they just let the bomb throwing happen, but also still try to get on with business and sort of let them happen simultaneously, and let the Freedom Caucus do that kind of stuff and make outrageous statements and claims, but also get the work done with other members of the leadership team.
As long as they're balancing that out, it's okay to make the bomb throwing comments, I guess. Okay, Chris?
Well, and one of the things I think will be interesting to see is how the Freedom Caucus and the MAGA Trump supporters play with the other Republicans. And if we look at the U.S. Congress as an example, at the end of 2024, there was a budget dust-up. We had a continuing resolution. Elon Musk and then, at the time, President-elect Trump came out and said it was a bad deal. A new deal was put forward that Trump liked, and it failed in the U.S. House, even though there was a Republican majority. It needed 2/3 to pass. It didn't even get a simple majority. So it'll be interesting to see on a more local level, the Arizona legislature, how those things play out over time.
That's interesting. Wayne, I want to go back to something Camryn said about the bomb throwing idea. I'm just wondering when Chris says things about other Republicans. For a while there was Paul Boyer, who in no one's eyes is a moderate or left of center, very conservative as well, but was, at least it seemed like he was the one obstacle to other Republican state lawmakers who wanted to put some of the Maricopa County supervisors in jail. Is there a Republican? Is there a moderate Democrat even? Are there people you could see trying to play both sides, trying to be negotiators, or are we going to see really as much as possible, as much as a lot of people sort of expect, Republicans are going to dig their heels and the Democrats will as well, and we just won't see much of that? I guess I'm asking, is there anyone you can see being a bridge, at least on certain issues?
Yeah, well, to touch on the first side of that, I'd say the Republican legislature is firmly MAGA. There are a lot of different factions within that, Freedom Caucus, as Camryn mentioned, and those that don't identify that way, but they are all pro Donald Trump. So they're pretty unified on that front. But in terms of crossing the aisle to make those negotiations, I don't know that there's a lot of incentive from Republicans to do that, given that they've increased their majorities. And as I mentioned earlier, there's not really an incentive for any individual member to stray from that now that one member can't make a big difference. However, on the Democratic side, there are lawmakers we've seen who have been more than willing to kind of cross the aisle in certain situations, talk with their colleagues. I'm thinking of someone like Alma Hernandez from down there in Tucson. She's always shown a willingness to work with Republicans. She actually, I think, said some nice things on social media recently about Juan Ciscomani, your congressman from down there. So I could see her being someone who maybe gets a bill or two through when other Democrats find it hard to do that.
Camryn, what do you think?
Yeah. Okay. So I do agree that I think that between the U.S. House and the Arizona legislature is much more with the Republicans, super, super Trumpy. And even with Montenegro and Peterson, even though they're not considered part of the Freedom Caucus, you can see in the legislation, or really in the committee assignments that have come out recently, that they've created this federalism committee and these Doge committee inspired committees. And they've said that is inspired by what's happening at the federal level. And they really want to make sure that Trump's agenda is going through smoothly in Arizona, or even a mirrored format. So I'm curious to see what that means. But then when it comes to the idea of these moderates, I think it's not fun if you want to have a long political career to be that guy, to be Paul Boyer or Ken Bennett, because as you've noticed, they're not here anymore.
Right.
It's not a coincidence. And I think that they have been somewhat weeded out, at least in this most recent election, when it comes to the Republicans. When I look around, I'm not seeing a lot of those folks who used to be there. I think Ken Bennett was a big target for that exact reason. He killed like a transgender bill, for example, that the Republican Party was pushing, and he just wasn't on board with all of their issues 100%.
Yeah, Chris, now I've covered this a lot. There used to be somewhat easy to find a few moderates here and there, not so much anymore.
It used to be, and I always think of Ken Bennett, and back, now I'll date myself, when Ken Bennett and Tim B were in leadership, they went to then Governor Napolitano, who was a Democrat. They were Republicans. When their own caucus really could not get a budget agreement, they went to the Democratic governor and worked out a deal. Now, they were both quickly voted out after that, but Bennett then returned. So those days, at least for now, seem to be gone.
Okay. Camryn, let me start with you on I know it's early. Session hasn't even started yet, and we always hear, all the legislators have to do is pass a budget. That's their job, and then, of course, it takes many months to get there. What are you looking for right now as it comes to the budget when it relates to priorities? Are we in a surplus? Are we not in a surplus? What are we looking at as far as numbers, too?
I think they're in a better spot than they were last year in terms of having some money to throw around, but it's still not exactly going to be everyone gets whatever they want. And as I've said in the past, I think when people think there's money to go around, it's even more chaotic in a way, because people think that, if they just lobby hard enough, they can get their project approved. But everyone has that mindset, as opposed to when you're just like, no, there's no money. Then people are kind of like, okay, fine. I think the budget, I expect Hobbs will say something similar at the beginning as what she did last year, which is like, I want to go after ESAs, but I also expect that that's still going to be a non-starter. I think that education funding is going to be a big one. And I've heard the same rumor that I've heard every single year, which is that we're going to actually get out early this time, but I don't let myself believe
well,
that.
What's
anymore.
Early, Camryn? Is early, is that before June 30th, or what is that?
I dream of like April.
So when you leave, you can actually enjoy the weather and not just be stuck in the caves there until it's 100 degrees?
Yeah. It's just a dream.
Well, it was nice. I mean, I'm sorry to make you wistful there, but that's a nice dream. Wayne, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, as Camryn mentioned, I think at this point we're projected to have a couple $100 million surplus, but there's also a lot of big spending guarantees and things that are coming up as well. So I don't know that they're going to be treating it like the spending free-for-all that we had a few years ago, where every legislator got a little pot of money to spend to get them on board with the budget. As Camryn mentioned, I think, as always, education is going to be a big funding priority for the governor and for Democrats. And then on the other side, ESAs, and I know there's some money that's wanted for administration of that program. So that's going to be a big deal. I think water and how we address that on the policy side is going to be a huge deal. And then spending is always going to come along with that, because whatever's happening, it's going to have to be paid for in some way.
I want to come back and dig in on all of those more in a moment. But Chris, you had a chance recently. You were in Attorney General Chris May's office, and she weighed in on certain things that she would like to get some money back from. Mentioned opioids.
She did. Last year, the legislature took some money out of the opioid settlement, which Mays now at the end of last year was still upset about. And she knows that money is never coming back in its totality. But she's hoping that some of it comes back, especially as she said, one of the companies that paid into the opioid settlement also has a contract with the state to provide health care in prisons, and some of that money went to them, and she said it's almost like paying them back. She'd like to see some of that money come back to the opioid settlement. And interestingly, she talked about the ESAs also. Her office is prosecuting ESA fraud, but one of the things she said that is wrong with ESAs, keep in mind she's a Democrat, she does not like the full expansion of them, she said, is the Department of Education doesn't have enough staff to administer that program. And she seems supportive of the idea of give them the administrative staff they need. Maybe that will cut down on the fraud, because people can actually read the paperwork and do things like that. So there might be, it's way too early to tell, some Democratic agreement on that, though no Democrat will ever probably say that ESAs universally are a good idea.
Yeah, Wayne, that was one of the points that was made recently. In fact, I may have seen you make this on Horizon up in Phoenix. This idea that Tom Horn is now going to give basically, here's a $2,000, if you are spending less than $2,000, we're not even going to check it. And part of that is the legislature funded as far as ESAs, but they did not fund nearly enough as far as administrative help. I don't want to say regulation because that's, anathema to a lot of Republicans, but how much does that affect things when it comes to budgeting, that even if Democrats are universally opposed to expansion of ESAs, that they might actually want some money to be there to help the program run as functionally as possible?
Yeah, I actually spoke to Superintendent Horn about this recently, and he basically said, yeah, this whole backlog they have where they have months and months and months where they can't approve expenses for families is all resulting from Attorney General Mays had sent a letter to him saying, hey, you guys aren't following the rules. Here's additional steps you need to take to make sure these purchases are following all the rules. So he said, we're doing that, but it's taking a lot longer to now process these because our staff hasn't grown at the same pace as the actual enrollment in the program. And he told me that he actually talked to me about this. We're going to approve all purchases under $2,000 and then go back and check them later, basically, as a way of getting rid of that backlog so they can get on top of this. And he said he is going to be asking for a funding bill that will add additional staff members to that program. And yeah, I could see some Democrats supporting that. Again, I don't know that all of them will, because some of them might just see it as an increase in funding for the program. But I could see some more moderate folks as part of the budget wheeling and dealing on the Democratic side get on board with that, and potentially the governor signing it as a way of saying, well, these staff members are going to be making sure that the money is spent correctly and not either on outright fraud on expenses that are seen as exorbitant.
And Camryn, what's the balancing act on that, considering if there were more money given to at least the administrative aspects of expanding ESA? And then at the same time, there are a lot of Democrats or left of center folks who are concerned that a lot of Republicans in the state legislature just are not big fans of K-12 public education as it is. How does all of this come together? I mean, because to a lot of folks, again, the K-12 system in Arizona has been, getting mistreated for a very long time and underfunded for a long time.
I'm picturing a lot of outrage among the Democrats when someone pitches, hey, let's make sure that the education department has more money and more staff to run the ESA program, even if it's for the intention of cutting down on fraud, and people just being like, are you serious? We need more of that money for public education and you want to give it to the ESA program. And that just being very black and white for some people. I can definitely see that happening. I don't know about the governor herself. I think, she's in budget mode, and so she has to negotiate with Republicans. But I think that would be a pretty tough sell to a lot of groups, which would be awkward, especially since, pretty soon Hobbs is going to have to go up for re-election. I don't know. It just sounds like a recipe for chaos and disaster. When it comes to the public education issue, I think we're all going to be looking at Prop 123 renewal, and how much, if teachers are going to get raises in public schools, how much that's going to be.
Well, and I think Camryn hit on something that we'll start to really see a little bit in this, I almost said semester. You can tell I work on a university campus this session, but the next session we'll really see is Hobbs is going to be up for re-election. And as we saw nationally in the 2024 election, Trump and other Republicans saying, don't give Biden a win legislatively. Republicans in the legislature aren't going to want to give Hobbs many wins that she can campaign on. So it's her veto pen, I think, is going to get a lot of work, which will be used by Republicans against her. And she probably won't get a lot through because they're not going to want those wins.
Well, and Camryn, Chris jumped a year ahead or so, but this is a question I do want to ask. I'll start with you. When he mentioned having talked with Attorney General Mays, how do we look at the politics of this? I mean, Secretary Fontes is saying, "Oh no, I'm not going to run for governor. I'm going to run for re-election." Apparently, Attorney General Mays is probably going to run for re-election as well. But does that hang over some of this stuff? The idea the three of them are not necessarily chums.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think for this next year, maybe they're going to keep it quiet, but it's a little awkward since we've all heard those rumors that even if they don't run in the next cycle that they're going to want it the year after that. Maybe Mays and Fontes will compete with each other. I don't know. And there are other Democrats. Those are not the only 3 Democrats in the world who long for higher office. And so I think everyone's going to be testing the waters a little bit. And I definitely agree with the veto pen thing. I think that's a great strategy that the Republicans have employed with Hobbs, where they send up something and then she vetoes it, and then the press release comes out right away, and it's like, oh, Hobbs killed our bill that would have saved kids. She's pro infanticide, and then you can put that stuff on your little campaign folder.
Absolutely. So, Chris, first to you about the politics of this.
And we talked to Mays right at the end of the year, and we just bluntly asked her, "What are your plans?" And she laughed and said all the right things about she loves being Attorney General. She plans on running for re-election as Attorney General. We asked Fontes the same question not long after the election, and things were already swirling about him. He danced around it a little more. It would not surprise me to see Mays stay as Attorney General, and Fontes maybe not officially get in the gubernatorial race, but certainly put out some feelers to see if Hobbs may in fact be weak enough to take on in a primary. That's a heck of a gamble, especially for the Democrats as a whole. Would they be able to fill the Secretary of State's position if they wanted to hold that, because it does oversee elections? There's a whole lot that plays into it. And we've seen even at the end of 2024 on the issue of water in Cochise County, the governor was down there and said, I'm going to leave this to the legislature. About a week later, the Attorney General sent a about 3-page, as I called it, finger-wagging letter to ADWR, Department of Water Resources, saying you can do things now. And then right at the end of the year, the governor issued a new AMA, active management area, for the Wilcox Basin after saying, I'm going to wait for the legislature. So there seems to be Mays pushing the governor a little. We'll see how this plays out.
Wayne, how challenging does that make the governor's job? She already has to deal with a Republican legislature, and now she has 2 other powerful Democrats, and it's very public that they don't all work well together. How does that affect her coming up in this session?
I don't know how big of a roadblock it is, but it is definitely an unneeded distraction. Going back to what Chris was talking about with the opioid money last year, just something like that, where all of a sudden you've got a Democratic Attorney General suing a Democratic governor over the use of this money. It's an unneeded distraction when Democrats need unity. Unity is the one thing they can bring to the table. And sometimes when you see that fractious relationship happening, what little wins they might be able to scrape together seem to kind of move into the distance, because they need to be working together. That being said, I personally believe that Fontes and Mays are going to wait to duke it out in 6 years. But that's not based on any sourcing. That's just my read of the room.
Camryn, let me segue to the state of the state a little bit. We don't know at this point, obviously, exactly what the governor's going to say, although we have a pretty good idea. How much do you think water will be a part of that? As Chris emphasized, some of the stuff going on here with active management areas, and the fact that Attorney General Mays has been heavily involved in that. Is that something that Governor Hobbs is going to talk about a lot? And do you think she'll talk about it in a way that could bridge the gap across the aisle, or more, this is what I think is she going to be bolder than Governor Hobbs usually is?
I believe she's going to talk about water, and I believe she's going to be bold about it. And here's why. I have been covering water really, really aggressively because it's super fun. And this whole thing with Hobbs and Mays versus the Republicans has really turned up the temperature. Mays is making it sound like she is the champion of the people in rural Arizona protecting their groundwater. And I think Hobbs should probably latch onto that same message, because they can attack the Republicans and say, well, they haven't done anything to protect your groundwater. We have, and we are, and we're on the record doing it. And they didn't want to come to the table. We asked them to work with us, and they didn't work with us. Now this is mostly like a Hobbs thing I'm thinking of, at the legislature, to get a bill through that would be bipartisan, that would fix these issues. So I had to go do it myself, and I did it for you. I could see that being a really good message for her, and I think she should milk that. And I expect her to come in swinging with water. There's going to be a few big water issues to duke out this year. Colorado River negotiations is sort of a separate thing, but that's also ongoing. And I think that, the Republicans are really upset with the way that Hobbs and Mays have taken this on sort of unilaterally and sort of tried to skirt the legislature. And so I expect there's also going to be some more court battles.
Chris, on water?
Well, and I think especially on this rural water issue, and we'll stay at Cochise County for a moment, I think the governor is really going to hammer the legislature on that in particular, because there was a bill last year that would have put some management in place on the Wilcox Basin. And Gail Griffith in the legislature, that's her district. She helped block it. So the governor is going to hammer them on that. Then we get into La Paz County and Fondamonte, the Saudi Arabian-owned farm that Attorney General Mays has sued. And also she's getting ready to sue a Minnesota-based dairy farm, she told us, in Cochise County over the same issues. So these are going to be big issues, and I think the governor is going to jump on these because those are issues she can stand on very easily.
Wayne, I hate to do this to you. I've got about 45 seconds left to hit the topic of election-related legislation. I want to ask you about this. Republicans did very well. We heard a lot less talk about elections being stolen, probably because Republicans did so well. Are we going to see legislation, whether it's patterned after what Maricopa County Supervisor Tom Galvin came in? Can you give me about 30 seconds on that?
Yeah, I think we're going to see, we already are seeing bills drop from Republicans to speed up election results in Arizona. And just to put a fine point on it, they want to reform late earlies. Those are the mail-in ballots that are dropped off on election day that a lot of folks blame for stringing out the vote counting for days and days and days. They want to just kind of cut that and make you give them an ID and speed up that process. So yes, we're definitely going to see Republicans push for that, and we're going to see Democrats stand up against it. They think it limits access to the ballot. So that's going to be one of the big fights that we're watching at the legislature this year.
So very briefly to what Camryn said, I mean, is that something that is going to go forward? Do we think it's just going to be something that we want to see Governor Hobbs veto that?
I believe we're going to see a veto, at least at this point. That's the signal the governor has sent. She openly said, that she's going to veto a bill like that.
Thank you. Wayne Schutsky, Camryn Sanchez of KJZZ, Christopher Conover of AZPM. Thank you all for being on the press room. And thank you very much for joining us as well. I'm Steve Goldstein.